1997 in Italy, where it has remained in print ever since. Not only has the book provided instruction and inspiration for generations of Italian students, but it has been translated into 17 languages, including Persian, Russian, and Chinese. Remarkably, given the book's success, in an era when editorial facelifts, sequels, and new editions have become publishing norms, the book has not been revised or updated, apart from an augmented introduction that Umberto Eco wrote for the 1985 edition. Its durable rules and sound advice have remained constant, despite passing trends and changing technologies. I am not sure whether this qualifies it as a classic. A classic, Italo Calvino wrote, is a work which relegates the noise of the present to a background hum, but without rendering that hum inaudible. Indeed, at first glance, this book may seem incompatible with our present, considering that Chapter 6 is typewritten rather than word-processed and that Chapter 4 includes reproductions of index cards with handwritten corrections and additions. As unfamiliar as this way of taking notes may be to today's students, it evokes nostalgic memories for those of us who attended college before the 1990s. The persistence of how to write a thesis is not due to nostalgia, however, nor do I think it is because it renders the noise of the present remote. I believe the book's staying power has to do with the very essence of the humanities. The humanities are not a body of texts, objects, and information that we inherited from the past, either a remote past or one so recent that we perceive it as our present, although as soon as we examine it we understand that it is irrevocably gone. The humanities are the process of preservation and appropriation of that pastness, a process that requires specific skills acquired through practice, as all skills are. This book teaches a techne, in the Greek sense of applied and context-related knowledge, a sort of craftsmanship. This is why its title is not, say, what is a thesis, an ontological question. Its avowed objective, the thesis, is actually less important than the occurrence of writing it, of making it, how to write a thesis. Umberto Eco takes us back to the original purpose of theses and dissertations as defining events that conclude a program of study. They are not a test or an exam, nor should they be. They are not meant to prove that the student did his or her homework. Rather, they prove that students can make something out of their education. This is particularly important today, when we are more accustomed to thinking in compliance with the software of our laptop or doing research according to the logic of a tablet than to thinking and researching in a personal and independent way. Written in the age of typewriters, card catalogs, and writing pads, how to write a thesis is less about the final outcome than about the path and method of arriving there. For Aristotle, knowledge was pursued for its own sake, and such a pursuit could be justified only by an instinctive drive and the intellectual pleasure generated by the fulfillment of that instinct. For Kant, aesthetics and judgment were based on disinterestedness, they could not be programmed. Only experienced. The humanities are intrinsically creative and innovative. They are about originality and invention, not discovery. This is precisely Eco's testimony. Even more than a technical manual, this book is an invitation to ingenuity, a tribute to imagination. By exposing 21st-century students to long-established practices of scholarly research, this book will introduce them to the core skills that constitute the writing of a thesis, finding an important and intriguing topic, being thorough, taking pride in one's work, giving thoughts time to develop, identifying with a subject, and being resourceful in locating information about it. That is exactly what this book did for me, as a student and young scholar. How to Write a Thesis was first published just as I was beginning to think about writing my own thesis, and it was from the Italian edition of this book that I learned how to choose a topic, how to look for sources and prepare a bibliography, how to use my library's research systems, how to organize and prioritize information, and finally how to write a captivating professional dissertation. It remained an indispensable reference source to me for years, long after I had defended and published my thesis. When I began working at the University of Rome, I recommended it to my own students. Many professors in Italy today still refer their students to it, and many university websites in other countries quote long passages from the book as part of the protocol for students to become familiar with before they write a thesis. And yet, when I moved to the United States in 1993, I was not sure whether it made sense to bring How to Write a Thesis with me. Moving one's library to a new place always involves questions about one's future priorities. I distinctly remember taking up the book, turning over a few pages, balancing it in my hand, and hesitating. Things were changing quickly. ECO's methods of organizing and filing information were still effective, but word processors and the internet were beginning to offer exciting alternatives to long-established research and writing techniques. Use colors, ECO insisted, when marking a passage. Use abbreviations to emphasize the relevance of information. Use abbreviations to designate the passages you must reread. Supplement the underlining with adhesive page markers. Did this kind of advice still make sense? Moreover, the country in which I was going to live was the one where the standardization of research methodology and citation style had been codified as early as 1906 with the publication of the first edition of the Chicago Manual of Style. ECO himself may have been inspired by the profoundly renovated 12th edition of that manual, published in 1969. It sold more copies than the first 11 editions combined. This was a time, in the United States as well as in Europe, when higher education was undergoing significant expansion. How to Write a Thesis sanctioned an extensive diffusion of the humanities into society. It was a momentous transformation, as ECO recognized in his introduction to the book. Today the Italian university is a university for the masses. Students of all social classes arrive from a variety of high schools. An unprecedented number of young people were enrolling in universities to pursue the study of literature, history, and philosophy, often lacking and failing to acquire the cultural background necessary for careers as teachers, professors, editors, and journalists. ECO was aware of this predicament. As a university professor, he knew that the majority of students in Italian universities seldom attended classes, that very few of them would continue to write and do research, and that the degree they eventually earned would not necessarily improve their social conditions. It would have been easy to call for the system to be reformed so as not to require a thesis from students ill-equipped to write one, and for whom the benefit of spending several months working on a thesis might be difficult to justify in cold economic terms. But ECO did not believe that education belonged to an elite, or that it should lower its standards in including the non-elite. He understood that the writing of a thesis forced many students outside of their cultural comfort zone, and that if the shock was too sudden or strong, they would give up. For him, it was about tailoring the challenge to students' needs and capabilities, but without giving up thoroughness, complexity, and rigor. If students' interests and ambitions could be met, while the limits of their sense of security were stretched, education would be achieved. Writing a thesis, ECO wrote, requires a student to organize ideas and data, to work methodically, and to build an object that in principle will serve others. In reality, the research experience matters more than the topic. So I did bring How to Write a Thesis with me to the United States, and for the past 20 years have continued to use it and to recommend it to students who read Italian, or Spanish, or one of the many other languages into which it has been translated. As it ages, its usefulness only increases. The translation of How to Write a Thesis into English is long overdue. Among the many causes of today's crisis in the humanities is the fact that there is a loss of concrete practices and capabilities, of experiences, where one must work methodically, of opportunities to build an object. It is a crisis long in the making. I suspect that soon after the publication of How to Write a Thesis, ECO himself sensed that the cultural and political centrality that criticism had enjoyed since the post-war period was about to end. While he did not give up his scholarly research, he became engaged with fiction. In the fall of 1980, his first novel, The Name of the Rose, was published. The Society of the Spectacle had truly started, with its emphasis on ratings, market surveys, and opinion polls. But the pendulum may be swinging back. The digital humanities, for example, have revitalized archival research, philology, and curation. Today, Eco's book represents a similar invitation to rediscover the material foundation of knowledge, ideas, and research. Consider the complex filing system that he recommends. Each type of index card should have a different color and should include in the top right corner abbreviations that cross-reference one series of cards to another and to the general plan. The result is something majestic. The same information could have been recorded in a notebook or on slips of paper and then heaped together haphazardly, but this would not have accomplished the same thing. Eco's ordering is principally an ordering of the mind and therefore a pleasure in itself, something majestic. In fact, it constitutes a proposal for a sort of slow research, legitimized not by its results but by its procedures. An experience, a training in accuracy and responsibility. And one in innovation as well. Eco stresses the advantages of what he defines as academic humility, that is, the willingness to listen with respect to anyone, without this exempting us from pronouncing our value judgments. Both elements are indispensable, openness and judgment. There is a moment for listening and a moment for intervening. Another lesson that we can draw from How to Write a Thesis is that no discourse in the humanities can exist without intriguing an audience. The humanities deal with serious issues, but it is the responsibility of those who produce discourse on those issues to make them exciting to others. Eco has acknowledged this throughout his career. Whether writing about Thomas Aquinas, James Bond, fascism, or semiotics, he has consistently succeeded in entertaining and informing his readers at the same time. This book is no exception. Millions of readers have consulted the Chicago Manual of Style and followed its rules, but very few have read it from beginning to end. In the late 1970s, I did read every page of How to Write a Thesis, and I did so again recently, when Roger Conover told me he was considering having the book translated into English for publication by the MIT Press. It's interesting to think, almost 40 years after its publication in Italian, that reading this book from beginning to end in English could now become a natural exercise again. Francesco Erspamer, Harvard University. Translator's Foreword. If you consult any dictionary, you will see that the word exactitude is not among the synonyms of faithfulness. There are rather loyalty, honesty, respect, and devotion. Umberto Eco. Although Eco was referring to the translation of literary texts in the lines above, his principle of faithfulness has provided the foundation for our translation of Come si fa una tesi di gloria. We have striven to create a translation that is loyal to the original text but also useful and enjoyable to contemporary English readers. Although most of the students for whom Eco wrote this book in 1977 shared a genuine desire for the challenges and rewards of a university education, many lacked the time, resources, and experience to navigate a university system embroiled in the social and economic crisis that Eco describes in his original introduction to the book. Because these unique circumstances define the book's ethos, we have preserved evidence of the book's historical context whenever possible. We have anglicized only the most obtrusive Italian references. We have replaced Italian expressions with close English equivalents only when necessary, and we have preserved others when the meaning was clear in English, despite their probable unfamiliarity to English readers. Most importantly, we have made every effort to preserve Eco's stern but nurturing tone that so stimulated and inspired his original readers. The author of Come si fa una tesi di gloria held his students to a single, high standard, but he also demonstrated unfailing empathy and genuine commitment to their progress. We hope the same will be said of the author of How to Write a Thesis. This book contains references to a great number of foreign books and articles, many of which have not been translated into English. We have indicated that there is no published English translation of a work by including our translation of the title after the original title, in sentence style and enclose it in parentheses. Where a published English translation does exist, we have used its title alone, unless the context also required the original title. Although this system may occasionally seem cumbersome, we feel that it achieves the best balance between readability and bibliographical accuracy, since it indicates the cited work's original language where the context fails to do so. For the most part, English readers need not be familiar with the literature that Eco cites to follow his argument, and the references themselves provide a rare glimpse of Eco's diverse interests. In fact, many of the works were obscure to his Italian readers in the 1970s, and they are infinitely more accessible to today's wired readers than they were to Eco's hypothetical Italian student whose only resource was the card catalog in his modest hometown library. And speaking of this student who reappears throughout the book, instead of replacing him with a contemporary English equivalent, we have left him unequivocally Italian, and in his original context of what may seem to us like the dawn of information technology. We hope English-speaking students will not only relate to his struggles and successes, but also gain valuable perspective from his unique situation, a situation that originally necessitated this book. Early drafts of our translation occasionally suffered from the exactitude against which Eco warns, primarily on a sentence and paragraph level, and for this reason we have made many cosmetic changes. These include adding context, omitting redundancies, updating archaisms, clarifying obscure references, correcting typos and other errors, Americanizing distances and currencies, and making other functional and stylistic choices that we hope have liberated Eco's nuanced ideas for a new generation of English-speaking readers. Additionally, we envisioned a translation that would serve English-speaking students as well as the original has served students in Italy. Rather than take an overarching approach to translating all of Eco's writing instructions, we have approached them on a case-by-case basis. We have omitted certain instructions that do not apply to English, and that would have held only trivial value for the English reader. We have revised other instructions to conform to current English usage whenever we could do so without undue violence to the original text, and whenever the results would be relevant to English-speaking students. Finally, Eco occasionally provides instructions that do not reflect current English usage, but that are nonetheless valuable because of the perspective or argument they contain. These we have kept and noted as such. Finally, we have preserved Eco's handwritten index card research system in all its detail, precisely because it is the soul of how to write a thesis. Obviously, the card catalog of the small-town library is primitive compared to today's online research systems, but the research skills that Eco teaches are perhaps even more relevant today. Eco's system demands critical thinking, resourcefulness, creativity, attention to detail, and academic pride and humility. These are precisely the skills that aid students overwhelmed by the ever-growing demands made on their time and resources, and confused by the seemingly endless torrents of information available to them. Much as today's college students lug laptops to the library in their backpacks, Eco's students lugged their files of index cards. Today's students carry access to boundless information that Eco's students could not have begun to fathom, but Eco's students owned every word they carried. They meticulously curated every byte of information, and they enjoyed the profound rewards of both the process and the product. Our sincerest thanks to Matthew Abate, Pascal Brault, Fabrizio Cariani, Gary Chistaro, Roger Conover, Michael Noss, and Anna Suchek. Katerina Mongiat Farina and Jeff Farina DePaul University. Introduction to the original 1977 edition. In the past, the Italian university was an elite institution. Only the children of university graduates attended, and with rare exceptions, students had all the time they needed at their disposal. The university allowed students to proceed slowly, with time allotted for study, for healthy fraternal pastimes, or for the activities of student government. Classes took the form of prestigious lectures, after which the most interested students would convene with professors and their teaching assistants in unhurried seminars, consisting of 10 or 15 people at the most. This is still the case in many American universities, where a course never exceeds 10 or 20 students who pay generously for unlimited access to their professors. In Oxford and other British universities, there is a professor who advises the research thesis of as few as 1 or 2 students each year, and who follows their work on a daily basis. If the situation in Italian universities were similar, there would be no need to write this book, although some of its advice may also be useful in the ideal academic situation I describe above. But today the Italian university is a university for the masses. Students of all social classes arrive from a variety of high schools. Perhaps they enroll in philosophy or classics, even if they come from a technical high school where they have never studied ancient Greek or Latin. Some Italian university courses have thousands of enrolled students and are taught by a professor who knows only the 30 or so who attend most frequently. Even with the help of teaching assistants, the professor may be able to engage only 100 students with some regularity during the semester. Among these students, there are many affluent young men and women who were raised in cultivated families and exposed to lively cultural environments, how are able to take educational trips, attend art and theater festivals, and go abroad. Then there are the others, students who, for example, work in the city clerk's office in their hometown of only 10,000 inhabitants, a town where there are perhaps only newsstands that substitute for proper booksellers. Other such students, disappointed by their university experience, become radicalized and seek education through political action, but they too must eventually meet their thesis obligations. Still others are forced to choose their courses by calculating the cost of required textbooks. These students may refer to a $13 course by cost rather than by topic, and choose the less expensive of 2 electives. And finally, there are students who have never learned how to take advantage of the resources of their hometown libraries, how to sign up for a library card, how to search for a book, or in which libraries to look. The advice in this book is especially useful for these students, as well as for high school graduates who are about to embark on their college studies and who wish to understand the alchemy of the university thesis. With this book, I would like to convince these students of 2 points. 1. One can write a decent thesis despite being in a difficult situation resulting from inequity past and present. 2. Regardless of the disappointment and frustration that these students may experience at the university, their thesis provides an opportunity to regain a positive and progressive notion of study. According to this notion, studying is not simply gathering information, but is the critical elaboration of an experience. Through study, students acquire the capacity to identify problems, confront them methodically, and articulate them systematically in expository detail. These skills will serve students for a lifetime. That said, this book is not an attempt to fully explain how to carry out academic research, nor is it a theoretical dissertation on the value of study. It is only a series of considerations on how to present oneself before a committee with a physical object, prescribed by Italian law, and constituted by a certain quantity of typewritten pages, that is supposed to have some relationship to the discipline of one's major. And that will not plunge one's thesis advisor into a state of painful stupor. Let it be clear that this book will not tell you what to put into your thesis. That is your job. This book will tell you: 1. What constitutes a thesis? 2. How to choose the topic and organize a work schedule. 3. How to conduct bibliographical research. 4. How to organize the material you find. 5. How to format the thesis. Inevitably, this book will provide the most precise instruction on the final task in this list, even if it seems to be the least important, because it is the only one with a fairly exact set of rules. This book deals with a thesis in the humanities. Since my experience relates to studies in literature and philosophy, the majority of the examples in this book naturally concern such topics. However, within the limits set by this book, the criteria I suggest are also applicable to a thesis in political science, education, or law. If you adopt a historical or theoretical approach rather than an experimental or applicative one, you should be able to use the model I propose for a thesis in architecture, economics, business, or some scientific topics, but do not trust me too much on those. At the time of this book's publication, the reform of the Italian university is being debated, and there is talk of introducing 2 or 3 different levels of university degrees. It remains to be seen if this reform will radically change the concept of the thesis. If this reform creates various levels of university degrees, as is the case in most foreign countries, we will have a situation similar to what I describe in the first chapter, and there will be a PhD thesis in addition to the thesis already required for the laurea, currently the terminal humanities degree offered by Italian universities. The advice I provide in this book applies to both of these, and I will clarify when there are differences between them. Therefore, I believe that the following pages can guide students through a long transition toward perspective reform. Cesare Segre read the manuscript of this book and has provided advice. Since I heeded some and disregarded some, he is not responsible for the final product. Naturally, I wholeheartedly thank him. Finally, the following pages address both male and female students, and they refer to both male and female professors. However, when the language doesn't provide a gender-neutral expression, I have chosen to use the male, and I mean no gender discrimination with this grammatical usage. Introduction to the 1985 edition. This new edition of my book has been published 8 years after the first. I initially wrote this book to avoid repeating time and again the same recommendations to my students, and since then the book has circulated widely. I am grateful to those colleagues who still recommend it to their students. I am most grateful to those students who discovered it by chance, after years of trying unsuccessfully to complete their college degree, and who wrote to me and said that these pages had finally encouraged them to start their thesis, or to finish one they had started. I must take some responsibility for facilitating an increase in the number of Italian college graduates, although I am not sure that this is a good thing. Although I wrote this book based on my personal university teaching experience, and with the humanities in mind, I discovered that it was useful to almost everyone, since it focuses on the spirit, mentality, and research methods required to write a good thesis, rather than on its content. Therefore, this book has been read by people not pursuing or not yet pursuing university studies, and even by middle school students preparing research projects or reports. This book has been translated into the languages of foreign countries that have different thesis requirements. Naturally, editors in those countries have made some adjustments, yet it seems that on the whole they have been able to retain the general argument. This does not surprise me, since the methods necessary to conduct high-quality research, at any level of complexity, are the same all over the world. When I was writing this book, the reform of the Italian university had not yet been implemented. In the original introduction, I suggested that this book was appropriate not only for the traditional laurea thesis but also for the PhD thesis that was about to be implemented as part of these reforms. I believe my prediction was sensible, and today I feel I can present these pages even to a PhD student. In the introduction to the first edition, I talked about the shortcomings of the Italian university, shortcomings that made my little book useful to the many thousands of students who otherwise lacked the instruction to successfully complete their thesis. Today, I would happily send the remaining copies of this book to the recycling bin rather than have to republish it. Alas, these shortcomings remain, and my original argument is as relevant today as it was in 1977. Strange things have happened to me since this book first appeared. For example, periodically I receive letters from students who write, "I must write a thesis on such and such a topic." They ask, "Would you be so kind as to send me a complete bibliography so that I can proceed with my work?" Evidently, these students have not understood the purpose of the book, or have mistaken me for a wizard. This book tries to teach one how to work independently, not how and where to find, as Italians say, the prepared meal. Moreover, these students have not understood that compiling a bibliography is a time-consuming project, and if I were to complete even one of these students' requests, I would have to work a few months, if not longer. If I had all that time available, I swear to you that I would find a better way to spend it. Here I would like to recount the most curious thing that happened to me. It regards a section of this book, specifically section 4.2.4 on the topic of academic humility. In this section, I attempted to show that the best ideas do not always come from major authors, and that no intellectual contribution should be shunned because of the author's status. As an example, I recounted the writing of my own laurea thesis, during which I found a decisive idea that resolved the thorny theoretical problem in a small book of little originality written in 1887 by a certain Abbot Valet, a book that I found by chance in a market stall. After the book you are reading appeared, Beniamino Placido wrote a charming review in La Repubblica. In it he likened this story of my research adventure with the Abbot Valet to the fairy tale in which a character becomes lost in the woods. As happens in fairy tales, and as has been theorized by the Soviet formalist V. Y. Prop, the lost character meets a donor who gives him a magic key. Placido's interpretation of my story was not that bizarre, considering that research is after all an adventure, but Placido implied that, to tell my fairy tale, I had invented the Abbot Valet. When I met Placido, I told him, "You are wrong, the Abbot Valet exists, or rather he existed, and I still have his book at home. It has been more than 20 years since I have opened it, but since I have a good visual memory, to this day I remember the page on which I found that idea, and the red exclamation point that I wrote in the margin. Come to my home and I will show you the infamous book of the Abbot Valet." No sooner said than done. We go to my home, we pour ourselves 2 glasses of whiskey, I climb a small ladder to reach the high shelf where, as I remembered, the faded book had rested for 20 years. I find it, dust it, open it once again with a certain trepidation, look for the equally faded page, which I find with its beautiful exclamation point in the margin. I show the page to Placido, and then I read him the excerpt that had helped me so much. I read it again, and I am astonished. The Abbot Valet had never formulated the idea that I attributed to him, that is to say he had never made the connection that seemed so brilliant to me, a connection between the theory of judgment and the theory of beauty. Valitratovs methingels, stimulated in some mysterious way by what he was saying, I made that connection myself and as I identified the idea with the text I was underlining, I attributed it to Valet. And for more than 20 years I had been grateful to the old abbot for something he had never given me. I had produced the magic key on my own. But is this really how it is? Is the merit of that idea truly mine? Had I never read Valet, I would never have had that idea. He may not have been the father of that idea, but he certainly was, so to speak, its obstetrician. He did not gift me with anything, but he kept my mind in shape, and he somehow stimulated my thinking. Is this not also what we ask from a teacher, to provoke us to invent ideas? As I recalled this episode, I became aware that many times over the course of my readings, I had attributed to others ideas that they had simply inspired me to look for, and many other times I remained convinced that an idea was mine until, after revisiting some books read many years before, I discovered that the idea, or its core, had come to me from a certain author. One credit I had given to Valet made me realize how many debts I had forgotten to pay. I believe the meaning of this story, not dissonant with the other ideas in this book, is that research is a mysterious adventure that inspires passion and holds many surprises. Not just an individual but also an entire culture participates, as ideas sometimes travel freely, migrate, disappear, and reappear. In this sense, ideas are similar to jokes that become better as each person tells them. Therefore, I decided that I must preserve my gratitude to the abbot valet, precisely because he had been a magical donor. This is why, as maybe some have already noticed, I introduced him as a main character in my novel The Name of the Rose. He first appears in the second line of the introduction, this time as a literal donor of a lost manuscript and a symbol of a library in which books speak among themselves. I am not sure what the moral of this story is, but I know there is at least one, and it is very beautiful. I wish my readers to find many abbots valet over the course of their lives, and I aspire to become someone else's abbot valet. 1. The definition and purpose of the thesis. 1.1. What is a thesis, and why is it required? A thesis is a typewritten manuscript, usually 100 to 400 pages in length, in which the student addresses a particular problem in his chosen field. Italian law requires students to successfully complete a thesis before they are granted the laurea, currently the terminal humanities degree offered by Italian universities. Once the student has passed all required exams and finished writing his thesis, he defends it in front of a committee. During this defense, the thesis advisor and one or more readers give a report that may include objections to the candidate's thesis. This report sparks a discussion in which other professors participate as members of the committee. The advisor and a second professor identify the strengths and weaknesses of the thesis and evaluate the candidate's capacity to defend the opinions he expressed in his thesis, and these influence the committee's final evaluation. After calculating the student's grade point average, the committee evaluates the thesis on a numeric scale of 66 to 110 points. The committee may also grant a score of 110 cum laude and designate the thesis as worthy of publication. This process applies to a laurea in the humanities, as other fields of study may have different requirements. As you may know, most universities around the world do not require a thesis for a first-level degree. In some universities, there are also certain higher-level degrees that are obtainable without a thesis. In others, there is a first-level degree that has similar requirements to the Italian laurea, obtainable through a series of exams and, in some cases, through completion of a less demanding research project. Still, other universities offer various second-level degrees that require thesis-like research projects of varying complexity. Some universities outside of Italy also confer a certificate degree, called a licentiate, that shares certain affinities with the Italian laurea. The licentiate in its various forms verifies a graduate's competence within a certain profession. However, outside of Italy, the thesis proper generally applies to the doctorate, a degree pursued by those students who wish to specialize and pursue academic research in a particular discipline. Although the doctorate has various designations in different parts of the world, we will use the common abbreviation PhD. Although this is an abbreviation for Doctor of Philosophy, it is generalized internationally to refer to anyone with a doctorate in the humanities, from the sociologist to the ancient Greek scholar. The PhD certifies competence in academic research, and most PhD graduates appropriately pursue academic careers. In universities around the world that traditionally grant the PhD, the thesis usually refers to a doctoral thesis, known as a dissertation. This is a piece of original research through which the candidate must demonstrate his scholarly capability of furthering his discipline. Although there are very young PhDs, the dissertation is generally not undertaken as an Italian student undertakes a laurea thesis at the age of 22, but rather when he is older, sometimes as old as 40 or 50. Why wait so long? Because the dissertation is a piece of original research, in which one must not only know the work of other scholars but also discover something that other scholars have not yet said. In the humanities, this discovery will rarely be a sweeping invention such as atomic scission, the theory of relativity, or a medicine that cures cancer. PhD candidates in the humanities make more modest scholarly discoveries, a new way to interpret and understand a classic text, the attribution of a manuscript that illuminates an author's biography, a reassessment of secondary studies that ripens ideas once wandering lost in various other texts. In any case, the scholar must produce a work that, in theory, other scholars in the field should not ignore, because it says something new. Is the Italian-style laurea thesis of the same kind? Rarely. In fact, since students undertake it in their early 20s while they are still completing their coursework, a laurea thesis cannot represent the conclusion of long research and contemplation, or provide evidence of full scholarly maturation. Therefore, although there may be an occasional laurea thesis that attains the quality of a PhD thesis, most do not. Nor does the university encourage such an accomplishment. In fact, a good laurea thesis need not be a research thesis in the traditional sense. Instead, it can take the form of a literature review. In a literature review, the student simply demonstrates that he has critically read the majority of the existing critical literature, or the published writings on a particular topic. The student explains the literature clearly, connects the various points of view of its authors, and thus offers an intelligent review, perhaps useful even to a specialist in the field who had never conducted an in-depth study on that specific topic. Therefore, the student seeking a laurea has a choice. He can write a literature review appropriate for a laurea degree, or he can undertake a research thesis, one that could even attain the level of scholarship appropriate for a PhD. A research thesis is always more time-consuming, laborious, and demanding. A literature review can also be laborious and time-consuming, but will usually require less time and present less risk. Writing a literature review in no way precludes a student from later taking the avenue of research. The review can constitute an act of diligence on the part of the young scholar who, before beginning independent research, wants to clarify for himself a few ideas by gathering background information on the topic. This is certainly preferable to producing a hastily finished work that claims to represent research but is in fact just a bad thesis that annoys readers and does no good for its author. Accordingly, the choice between a literature review and a research thesis is linked to the student's ability and maturity. And regrettably, it is often linked to financial factors, because a working student certainly has less time and energy to dedicate to long hours of research and trips to foreign research institutes or libraries, and often lacks money for the purchase of rare and expensive books and other resources. Sadly, this book will not offer advice on financial matters. Until a short time ago, research was the privilege offered students around the world. Today, academic scholarships, travel scholarships, and foreign research grants have hardly solved this problem. A more just society would be one in which research was a profession funded by the state, and only people with true aspirations to study were compensated. It would be a society in which a piece of paper was not required to find employment or to obtain a promotion in the public sector, and a university graduate would not surpass other qualified applicants simply because the graduate had earned a laurea. But this is not the case in the Italian university, nor in the Italian society in which it was born. We can only hope that students of all social classes can attend the university without stressful sacrifices, and then proceed to explain the many ways in which one can write a decent thesis, taking into account one's available time, energy, and specific aspirations. 1.2. For whom is this book written? Given the situation described above, we must assume that there are many students who are forced to write a thesis so that they may graduate quickly and obtain the career advancement that originally motivated university enrollment. Some of these students may be as old as 40. They will ask for instructions on how to write a thesis in a month, in such a way as to receive a passing grade and graduate quickly. We should then say resolutely, this book is not for them. If these are their needs, if they are the victims of paradoxical legal circumstances that force them to graduate so they may resolve painful financial matters, they would be much better served by the following options. Invest a reasonable amount of money in having a thesis written by a second party. Copy a thesis that was written a few years prior for another institution. It is better not to copy a book currently in print, even if it was written in a foreign language. If the professor is even minimally informed on the topic, he will be aware of the book's existence. However, submitting in Milan a thesis written in Catania limits the probability of being caught, although it is obviously necessary to ascertain whether the thesis's advisor held a position in Catania before teaching in Milan. Consequently, even plagiarizing theses requires an intelligent research effort. Clearly, the two pieces of advice we have just offered are illegal. They are similar to advising an emergency room patient to put a knife to the throat of a doctor who refuses to treat him. These are desperate acts. We give this paradoxical advice to emphasize that this book does not attempt to resolve the serious temporal and financial problems that many university students currently face. However, this book does not require that the student be a millionaire or have a decade available to commit to his studies after having traveled the world. This book is for students who want to do rigorous work, despite the fact that they can only dedicate a few hours each day to study. This book is also for students who want to write a thesis that will provide a certain intellectual satisfaction, and that will also prove useful after graduation. As we will see, the rigor of a thesis is more important than its scope. One can even collect soccer trading cards with rigor, as long as he identifies the topic of the collection, the criteria for cataloging it, and its historical limits. It is acceptable for him to limit his collection to players active after 1960, provided that his collection is complete after this date. There will always be a difference between his collection and the Louvre, but it is better to build a serious trading card collection from 1960 to the present than to create a cursory art collection. The thesis shares this same criterion. 1.3. The usefulness of a thesis after graduation. There are two ways to write a thesis that is useful after graduation. A student can write a thesis that becomes the foundation of a broader research project that will continue into the years ahead, if he has the means and desire to do so. Additionally, writing a thesis develops valuable professional skills that are useful after graduation. For example, the director of a local tourist office who authored a thesis titled From Stephen Hero to a Portrait of the Artist as a young man will have developed skills needed for his profession. He will have done the following. 1. Identified a precise topic. 2. Collected documents on that topic. 3. Ordered these documents. 4. Re-examined the topic in light of the documents collected. 5. Organized all this work into an organic form. 6. Ensured that his readers have understood him. 7. Provided the necessary documentation so that readers may re-examine the topic through his sources. Writing a thesis requires a student to organize ideas and data, to work methodically, and to build an object that in principle will serve others. In reality, the research experience matters more than the topic. The student who was able to carefully research these two versions of Joyce's novel will have trained himself to methodically collect, organize, and present information, and for other professional responsibilities he will encounter working at the tourist office. As a writer myself, I have already published 10 books on different topics, but I was able to write the last 9 because of the experience of the first, which happened to be a revision of my own laurea thesis. Without that first effort, I would never have acquired the skills I needed for the others. And, for better or for worse, the other books still show traces of the first. With time, a writer becomes more astute and knowledgeable, but how he uses his knowledge will always depend on how he originally researched the many things he did not know. At the very least, writing a thesis is like training the memory. One will retain a good memory when he is old if he has trained it when he was young. It doesn't matter if the training involved memorizing the players of every Italian Aceres soccer team, Dante's poetry, or every Roman emperor from Augustus to Romulus Augustulus. Since we are training our own memory, it is certainly better to serve our interests and needs, but sometimes it is even good exercise to learn useless things. Therefore, even if it is better to research an appealing topic, the topic is secondary to the research method and the actual experience of writing the thesis. If a student works rigorously, no topic is truly foolish, and the student can draw useful conclusions even from a remote or peripheral topic. In fact, Marx wrote his thesis on the two ancient Greek philosophers Epicurus and Democritus, not on political economy, and this was no accident. Perhaps Marx was able to approach the theoretical questions of history and economy with such rigor precisely because of his scrupulous work on these ancient Greek philosophers. Also, considering that so many students start with an ambitious thesis on Marx and then end up working at the personnel office of a big capitalist business, we might begin to question the utility, topicality, and political relevance of thesis topics. 1.4. For obvious rules for choosing a thesis topic. Although we will discuss thesis topics in greater detail in the next chapter, the following rules will help you get started. They do not apply if the professor pressures you to choose a particular topic, or if you lack interest and are willing to choose any topic so as to graduate quickly. If you are inspired by a particular interest, and your advisor is willing to facilitate this interest, the following rules will guide you. 1. The topic should reflect your previous studies and experience. It should be related to your completed courses, your other research, and your political, cultural, or religious experience. 2. The necessary sources should be materially accessible. You should be near enough to the sources for convenient access, and you should have the permission you need to access them. 3. The necessary sources should be manageable. In other words, you should have the ability, experience, and background knowledge needed to understand the sources. 4. You should have some experience with the methodological framework that you will use in the thesis. For example, if your thesis topic requires you to analyze a Bach violin sonata, you should be versed in music theory and analysis. Put this way, these 4 rules seem banal. We could summarize them in this single rule: you must write a thesis that you are able to write. This rule may seem trivial, but it is true, and many a thesis has been dramatically aborted precisely because this rule was broken. The following chapters will provide instruction on how to write a thesis that is both manageable and feasible. 2. Choosing the topic. 2.1. Monograph or survey. The first temptation of any student is to write a thesis that is too broad. For example, the first impulse of a literature student is to write a thesis titled Literature Today. If advised to narrow the scope, the student might choose Italian literature from post-war period to the 60s, a topic with slightly more focus, but one that is still impossibly vast. A thesis like this is dangerous. Such a topic will make a seasoned scholar tremble, and will present an impossible challenge for a young student. Presented with this challenge, a student will either write a tedious survey consisting only of authors' names and current scholarly opinions, or will try to imitate the approach of a mature critic and will inevitably be accused of unforgivable omissions. In 1957, the great contemporary Italian critic Gianfranco Contini published a survey titled Letteratura Italiana. 800. Had the survey been a thesis, it would have earned a failing grade, despite its 472 pages in length. Contini dedicated entire chapters to so-called minor authors, and relegated certain major authors to mentions in short footnotes or omitted them altogether. The committee would have attributed these choices to carelessness or ignorance. Naturally, since Contini Saskalaroff recognized historical knowledge and critical acumen, readers understood that the omissions and disproportions were intentional, and that the absence of a particular author was a more eloquent expression of Contini's disfavor than a hostile review. But if a student in his 20s plays the same trick, who guarantees that there is shrewdness behind his silence? Do the omissions replace criticism that the student has written elsewhere, or that he would be capable of writing? Usually, with a thesis of this kind, the student later accuses the committee members of having failed to understand him. But a thesis that is too broad cannot be understood, and therefore is always an act of pride. It is not that intellectual pride in a thesis should be rejected a priori. A student can even argue that Dante was a lousy poet, but only after at least 300 pages of rigorous analysis of Dante's texts. However, the necessary breadth of a topic like Italian literature from the post-war period to the 60s leaves no space for these demonstrations, and this is why the student should aptly choose something more modest. Not the novels of Beppe Finoglio, but the different versions of Johnny the Partisan. Boring? Maybe, but the challenge it presents is ultimately more interesting. If you think about it, specificity is also an act of shrewdness. A survey of 40 years of literature is vulnerable to all kinds of objections. How can the advisor or another committee member resist the temptation to show his knowledge of a minor author absent from the student's work? If each committee member jots down even 2 or 3 omissions in the margins of the table of contents, the thesis will end up looking like a missing persons list. And the student will become the target of a burst of charges. If instead the student works diligently on a specific topic, he will find himself mastering material unknown to most of the committee members. I am not suggesting a cheap trick. The candidate simply presents himself as expert in front of a less expert audience, and since he worked hard to gain his expertise, it is fair that he benefits from the situation. Between these two extremes of a 40-year literature survey and a strict monograph on the variance of a short text, there are thesis topics of varying scope. We can find topics like the new literary avant-garde of the 60s, or the image of the Langham Pavese and Finoglio, or even similarities and differences in 3 writers of the fantastic, Savinio, Buzzati, and Landolfi. As for the sciences, a little book on the same topic as ours gives advice that is valid for all subjects. The subject geology, for instance, is much too broad a topic. Volcanology, as a branch of geology, is still too comprehensive. Volcanoes in Mexico might be developed into a good but superficial paper. However, a further limitation to the history of Popocatépetl would make for a more valuable study. Another limited topic, spanning fewer years, would be the birth and apparent death of Paricutin. Here, I would suggest the last topic, but only if the candidate really says all there is to say about that damned volcano. Some time ago a student approached me with the impossibly broad topic the symbol in contemporary thought. At the very least, I did not understand what the student meant by symbol, a term that has different meanings to different authors, meanings that are sometimes directly opposed. Consider that formal logicians and mathematicians designate with the term symbol certain expressions without meaning that occupy a specific place with a specific function in a given formalized calculus, whereas other authors use the term to mean a form full of ambiguous meanings, such as images in dreams, in which a tree can refer to a sex organ, the desire of growth, and so on. So how can anybody write a thesis with this title? One would have to analyze all of the meanings of symbol in all of contemporary culture, list their similarities and differences, determine whether there is an underlying fundamental unitary concept in each author and each theory, and whether the differences nevertheless make the theories in question incompatible. Well then, no contemporary philosopher, linguist, or psychoanalyst has yet been able to complete such a work satisfactorily. How can a neophyte succeed? How can we expect such a work from a young student who, albeit precocious, has no more than 6 or 7 years of academic reading behind him? Even if he could intelligently write at least part of an argument, he would still face the problems of Contini's history of Italian literature. Alternatively, he could neglect the work of other authors and propose his own theory of the symbol, but we will discuss this questionable choice in section 2.2. I spoke with the student in question. We discussed the possibility of a thesis on symbol in Freud and Jung, one that would have excluded all other definitions of the term and would have compared only the meanings given to it by these two authors. Then I learned that the student's only foreign language was English. We then settled on the concept of symbol in Peirce, a thesis that would require only English language skills. Naturally, over the course of the thesis, the student would have described how Peirce's definition of the term differed from that of authors such as Freud and Jung, but these German-speaking authors would not be central to the thesis. Nobody could object that the student had read these authors only in translation, since the thesis proposed to study only the American author fully and in the original language. In this way, we managed to limit the survey to a medium length, while not changing it into a strict monograph. This solution was acceptable to all. I should also clarify that the term monograph can have a broader meaning than the one we have used here. A monograph is the study of a single topic, and as such it is opposed to a history of, a manual, and an encyclopedia. A monograph can analyze many writers, but only from the perspective of a specific theme. For example, a monograph could appropriately be titled The Theme of the World Turned Upside Down in Medieval Writers, and it could explore the paradox in which fish can fly, birds can swim, and so on. The student could write an excellent monograph on this topic if he worked rigorously. However, this topic would include a vast amount of readings, as the student would need to familiarize himself with all the writers who treated the subject, however minor or obscure. The student might do well to narrow his scope to the theme of the world turned upside down in Carolingian poets. A student may consider a survey more exciting than a monograph, if only because focusing on the same author for 1, 2, or more years may seem boring. But the student should understand that a strict monograph also involves the author's cultural and historical context. A thesis on Beppe Finoglio's fiction requires reading related writers such as Cesare Pavese or Elio Vittorini, reading the American writers whom Finoglio read and translated, and examining Italian realism in general. It is only possible to understand and interpret an author within his wider cultural context. However, it is one thing for a portraitist to paint a landscape for his subject's background, and it is another thing to paint a complete, detailed landscape painting. The portrait of a gentleman might contain the countryside with a river in the background, but a landscape contains fields, valleys, and rivers, all in fine detail. The technique, or, in photographic terms, the focus must change between the two. In a monograph, the landscape can even be somewhat out of focus, incomplete, or unoriginal. Finally, remember this fundamental principle: the more you narrow the field, the better and more safely you will work. Always prefer a monograph to a survey. It is better for your thesis to resemble an essay than a complete history or an encyclopedia. 2.2. Historical or theoretical? This choice only applies to certain subjects. A thesis in history of mathematics, Romance philology, history of German literature and other similar subjects can and lib historical. A thesis on experimental subjects such as architectural composition, nuclear reactor physics, or comparative anatomy is usually theoretical. But there are other subjects such as theoretical philosophy, sociology, cultural anthropology, aesthetics, philosophia law, pedagogy, or international law that allow a thesis of both kinds. In a theoretical thesis, a student confronts an abstract problem upon which other works may or may not have already reflected: the nature of human will, the concept of freedom, the notion of social role, the existence of God, or the genetic code. Considered together, such topics may elicit smiles, as they require the writer to compose what Antonio Gramsci called brief notes on the universe. And yet illustrious thinkers have devoted themselves to such topics. However, they usually did so after decades of reflection. In the hands of less experienced students, these topics can generate two outcomes. The first and less worrisome is a survey like the one defined in the previous section, on which I have already provided observations. For example, the student tackles the concept of social role as it appears in the writings of a chosen set of authors. The second outcome is more tragic, because the candidate presumes he can solve the question of God or define the concept of freedom within only a few pages. My experience is that a thesis like this usually turns out to be short and unorganized, and resembles more a lyric poem than an academic study. Usually, when the committee objects to the candidate's argument as too personalized, generic, informal, and lacking in historiographic verification and evidence, the candidate responds that he has been misunderstood and that his thesis is more intelligent than other banal literature surveys. This may be true, but this answer usually comes from a candidate with confused ideas, one who lacks academic humility and communicative skills. I will define academic humility in section 4. 2.4. This candidate may indeed be a genius who has acquired a lifetime of knowledge in a mere 22 years, and let it be clear that I am presenting this hypothesis without any shade of irony. However, it takes a long time for mankind to notice that such a genius has appeared on the Earth's crust, and his work must be read and digested for a certain number of years before its greatness is grasped. How can we expect that the busy committee, responsible for so many students, should grasp at first sight the greatness of this lone runner? Let us hypothesize that the student believes he has understood an important problem. Since nothing is born from nothing, the student must have developed his thoughts under a particular author's influence. In this case, he should transform his theoretical thesis into a historiographic thesis. In other words, he should not discuss the problem of being, the notion of freedom, or the concept of social action, but develop the topics such as the question of being in early Heidegger, the notion of freedom in Kant, or the concept of social action in Parsons. His original ideas will emerge as he grapples with his author's ideas, as it is possible to say new things about freedom while studying an author's work on the concept. If he is ambitious, he can transform the theoretical thesis that he originally conceived into the final chapter of his historiographic thesis. Consequently, readers will understand his original ideas in the context of a previous thinker, and the concepts he proposes will gain support from their proper frame of reference. Even the brightest young writer will find it difficult to work in a vacuum and establish an argument ab initio. He must find a foothold in past scholarship, especially for questions as vague as the notions of being and freedom. Even if someone is a genius, and especially if someone is a genius, he will never be diminished by starting from another author's work. Building on a previous author's work does not mean a student must fetishize, adore, or swear by that author, and in fact the student can demonstrate the author's errors and limits. Medieval writers saw themselves as dwarves compared to the giant ancients they revered, and yet they could see further than the ancients because they were dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants. Not all of these observations are valid for applied and laboratory-based subjects. In psychology, for example, the alternative to the question of perception in Piaget is not the question of perception, even if there were a student reckless enough to attempt such a dangerously generic topic. The alternative to the first topic's historiographic approach is rather an experimental approach, such as the perception of colors in a group of handicapped children. This is a different story, because the student has the right to approach a question through experimentation, provided he has a sound research method, adequate laboratory conditions, and the necessary assistance. A good laboratory researcher will not begin an experiment without having compiled a literature review that examines the results of similar experiments. He would otherwise risk reinventing the wheel by proving something that has already been amply proven, or by applying methods that have already failed. Therefore, an experimental thesis requires library research, laboratory work, and an established research method. Here the student should follow the examples of the medieval authors and climb onto the shoulders of a giant, at least one of modest height, or even onto another dwarf. The student will always have the chance to develop his own original ideas later in his career. 2.3. Ancient or contemporary? Here I am not attempting to revive the age-old quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. Instead, I am here using the term ancient in the most general sense of very old, referring to authors whose works have survived and been studied by scholars. The choice between an ancient and a contemporary author does not apply to subjects such as the history of contemporary Italian literature, although even a thesis in Latin could involve both Horace and the state of Horatian studies in the last 2 decades. Nevertheless, Italian students frequently prefer contemporary authors, like Cesare Pavese, Giorgio Bassani, and Edoardo Sanguinetti, to the 16th-century Petrarchan or the 18th-century Arcadian poets suggested by their advisors. Sometimes the student chooses a poet out of an authentic love for his work, and this is a choice that is difficult to challenge. Other times the student is under the false conviction that a contemporary author is easier and more fun. Let us state from the outset that a thesis on a contemporary author is always more difficult. It may be true that scholarship on a contemporary author generally involves a smaller bibliography of easily accessible texts, and that the student can accomplish the first phase of the research by reading a good novel on the beach, rather than sitting in a library. The problem arises when the student begins to comment on the author, considering that the thesis will be flawed if he simply repeats what other critics have said. Since opinions on most contemporary authors are still vague and divided, the student's critical skills will be hindered by a lack of perspective, and the project will become enormously difficult. On the other hand, the texts of ancient authors are usually supported by a solid foundation of interpretation upon which the student can build. Certainly a thesis on an ancient author involves more laborious reading and more careful bibliographical research, but the titles are more organized, and complete bibliographies are common. Moreover, if the student approaches his thesis as a chance to learn how to properly conduct research, a thesis on a past author will provide better training. And even if the student has a flair for contemporary criticism, the thesis can provide a final opportunity for him to challenge himself with literature of the past, and to exercise his taste and reading skills. He would be in good company, for many great contemporary authors, even avant-garde authors, wrote their thesis on Dante or Foscolo rather than Montale or Pound. To be sure, there are no precise rules, and a good researcher can historically or stylistically analyze a contemporary or past author with equal philological acumen and precision. The problem also varies among disciplines. In philosophy, a thesis on Husserl might provide the student with a more challenging research experience than one on Descartes, and the fact that it is easier to read Pascal than Carnap shows that a modern author may require more laborious reading than an ancient. Therefore, I can confidently provide only this advice: work on a contemporary author as if he were ancient, and an ancient one as if he were contemporary. You will have more fun and write a better thesis. 2.4. How long does it take to write a thesis? Let us state from the outset, no longer than 3 years and no less than 6 months. This period includes not just the time necessary to write the final draft, which may take only a month or 2 weeks, depending on the student's work habits. Instead, this period begins at the genesis of the first idea and ends at the delivery of the final work. For example, a student may only work on his thesis for a year, but he may use ideas and readings accumulated in the 2 preceding years, even though he initially did not know what would come from this preliminary research. A thesis should take no more than 3 years because, if the student has failed to delimit his topic and find the necessary sources after this period, he has one of the following problems. 1. The student has chosen an overwhelming topic that is beyond his skill level. 2. The student is one of those insatiable persons who would like to write about everything, and who will continue to work on his thesis for 20 years. 3. The thesis neurosis has begun. The student abandons the thesis, returns to it, feels unfulfilled, loses focus, and uses his thesis as an alibi to avoid other challenges in his life that he is too cowardly to address. This student will never graduate. A thesis should take no less than 6 months because, even if the student's goal is a modest journal article of less than 60 typewritten pages, 6 months pass in a flash. This may not be sufficient time for the student to structure the work, research the bibliography, catalog the sources, and draft the text. Surely a more experienced scholar can compose an essay in less time, but only because he has years of reading behind him, complete with cataloged notes. The student must instead start from scratch. Ideally, the student will choose his thesis topic and thesis advisor toward the end of his sophomore year. By then the student has already become familiar with various subjects, and he even has a general understanding of disciplines he has not yet studied, their focus, and the difficulties they present. Such a timely choice is neither compromising nor irreversible. The student has an entire year to assess the choice, and if need be, to change the topic, the advisor, or even the discipline. Note that even if the student spends a year researching ancient Greek literature and later realizes that he prefers contemporary history, he has not wasted his time, as he will have learned how to create a preliminary bibliography, how to take notes on a text, and how to organize a table of contents. Remember the point we made in section 1.3, first and foremost, a thesis teaches one to coordinate ideas, and the topic is secondary. If the student chooses his topic toward the end of his sophomore year, he will have until the spring of the fourth year to graduate well within the time frame outlined above. He will have 2 complete years to finish his thesis and 2 summers to devote to research and, if he has the resources, to research trips. During this period, he can also choose courses and readings that are appropriate for his thesis. To be sure, if the student is writing a thesis on experimental psychology, he will still be required to take Latin or other unrelated courses. However, in courses related to philosophy and sociology, the student may be able to arrange with the professor to substitute texts related to the thesis for course texts, as long as this is done without dialectical contortions or puerile tricks. In this case, an intelligent professor will prefer a motivated student taking his course purposefully to one taking his course without passion, randomly, or out of an obligation to fulfill a requirement. In any case, nothing forbids the student from choosing a thesis topic earlier. And nothing forbids the student from choosing it later, if he is willing to take more than the prescribed 4 years to graduate. But the biggest mistake he can make is to fail to allow sufficient time for his thesis. If the student is to write a good thesis, he must discuss his work incrementally with his advisor, at least within reason. This is not to put the professor on a pedestal. Instead, because writing a thesis is like writing a book, working incrementally with the professor is a communication exercise that assumes the existence of an audience, and the advisor is the only competent audience available to the student during the course of his work. If the student completes the thesis hastily, the advisor will only have time to skim the text. Moreover, if the student presents the thesis to his advisor at the last minute, and if the advisor is dissatisfied with the results, he will challenge the candidate at the defense. This will produce unpleasant results not only for the student but also for the advisor, who should never arrive at a defense with a thesis he does not support. In this case, the advisor shares in the defeat. Early in the process, if the advisor notices that the candidate is having trouble, he must immediately inform the candidate and suggest either that the student pursue another topic or that he postpone his thesis until he is better prepared. If the student ignores this advice, and if he is in a rush to graduate or if he simply believes that his advisor is wrong, he will again face a stormy defense, but he will do so deliberately. Considering these risks, a 6-month thesis is certainly not the optimum choice, even though it is within our range of acceptability. But as we have implied, it may prove successful if the topic, chosen in the last 6 months, builds on research and experience gained in the years before. Also, sometimes a student must complete a thesis in 6 months because of some external necessity. In these cases, the student must find a topic that he can research thoroughly and that will yield a decent product in that short period of time. Here I do not want to sound too much like a salesman, as if I were selling an inexpensive 6-month thesis and a pricier 3-year thesis, a thesis to satisfy every kind of customer. Instead, my point is that, without a doubt, a student can produce a decent thesis in as little as 6 months. There are 3 requirements for a 6-month thesis. 1. The topic should be clearly defined. 2. The topic should be contemporary, eliminating the need to explore a bibliography that goes back to the ancient Greeks. Alternatively, it should be a marginal subject on which little has been written. 3. The primary and secondary sources must be locally available and easily accessible. Let us look at some examples. If I choose the topic The Church of Santa Maria di Castello in Alessandria, I can hope to find everything I need to reconstruct its history and the events of its restoration in the Municipal Library of Alessandria, and also in the city's civic archives. I use the word hope because I am speaking hypothetically and putting myself in the shoes of a student who hopes to complete a thesis in 6 months. Before I begin the project, I should test the validity of my hypothesis. First, I should verify that I will reside in or near Alessandria during the process. If I live 930 miles south in Caltanissetta, I have made a bad choice. Additionally, if some of the available sources are unpublished medieval manuscripts, I should know something of paleography and have the skills necessary to decipher these manuscripts. Here you can see how a seemingly easy topic can quickly become difficult. If I determine, instead, that all of the secondary sources have been published no earlier than the 19th century, I am safe to proceed on solid ground. Harry Sano, for example, Raffaele La Capriesa, contemporary Italian writer who has written only 3 novels and a single book of essays, all published by the Italian publisher Bompiani. Let us imagine a thesis with the title The Fortunes of Raffaele La Capria in Contemporary Italian Criticism. Since publishers commonly archive all of the critical essays and articles written about their authors, I can hope to find almost all the texts I need in a series of visits to the publisher in Milan. Since the author is living, I can write to him or interview him in person, ask him for other bibliographic suggestions, and probably even obtain photocopies of these relevant texts. Surely a certain critical essay will refer us to other authors to whom La Capria is compared or contrasted, widening the research field a bit, but in a manageable way. This project will pose no problem if I have chosen La Capria out of a more general interest in Italian contemporary literature. If this is not the case, I have probably chosen cynically, coldly, and recklessly. Here is another example of a 6-month thesis, the interpretation of World War II in middle school history books published in the last 5 years. The student may have some difficulty locating all of the Italian middle school history books in circulation, but in fact there are only a few scholastic presses. Once the student has acquired or photocopied the texts, he will find that the treatments of World War II occupy a few pages in each, and that he can quickly do good comparative work. However, in order to judge a book's treatment of World War II, the student must compare it to half a dozen reputable histories of the war, and also assess the book's treatment of history in general. Thus he must widen his scope. Surely, without these forms of critical examination, the student could write the thesis in a week rather than in 6 months, but it would take the form of a newspaper article instead of a thesis. The article may even be sharp and brilliant, yet it would still be unfit to document the candidate's research abilities. Ultimately, if you want to write a 6-month thesis but are only willing to commit an hour each day, there is no point in continuing our discussion. Please refer to the advice given in section 1.2, copy a thesis and call it quits. 2.5. Is it necessary to know foreign languages? This section does not concern those students writing a thesis on a foreign language or on foreign literature. One would hope that these students know the language on which they write their thesis. Better still, one would hope that a student studying a French author writes his thesis in French, as many universities around the world rightfully require. Also, the observations below are no substitute for learning the language by spending time in the country in question. However, this is an expensive solution, and here I would like to advise students who do not have this option. Let us pose the problem of an Italian student who writes his thesis in philosophy, sociology, law, political science, history, or natural sciences. Even if the thesis involves Italian history, Dante, or the Renaissance, the student will inevitably have to read a book in a foreign language, since illustrious scholars of Dante and the Renaissance have written in English, German, and other languages foreign to our Italian student. In these cases, the student generally uses the thesis as an excuse to start reading in a new language. If the student is motivated by the topic and up to the challenge, he will begin to gain understanding. Often this is how the student first learns a foreign language. Although he will not learn to speak the new language, he will learn to read it, which is better than nothing. If there is only one book in German on a specific topic, and if the student does not know German, he can ask someone to read him the most important chapters. He will have the decency not to rely on that particular book too much, but at least he will be able to legitimately include it in his bibliography. But these are all secondary issues. The main tenet is this: we should not choose a topic that involves foreign language skills that we do not currently possess, or that we are not willing to acquire. For now, let us examine some essential requirements. 1. We cannot write a thesis on a foreign author if we do not read his texts in the original language. This seems self-evident if the author is a poet, but many students do not see this as a prerequisite for a thesis on Kant, Freud, or Marx. However, it is required for 3 reasons. First, not all of the author's works may be available in translation, and sometimes neglecting even a minor work can lead to a misrepresentation of the author's intellectual background, or his work in general. Second, most of the secondary sources on a given author are usually in the author's original language, even if the author is available in translation, his critics may not be. Finally, the translation does not always do justice to an author's thought, and writing a thesis involves the act of restoring the author's original thought from the distortions of translations, and from vulgarizations of various kinds. Writing a thesis requires going beyond the easy formulas of school textbooks, such as Foscolo is a classicist while Leopardi is a romantic, or Plato is an idealist and Aristotle is a realist, or Pascal favors the heart and Descartes favors reason. 2. We cannot write a thesis on a topic on which the most important secondary sources are in a language we do not know. For example, since some of the past decades' most groundbreaking reassessments of Nietzsche's German texts have been written in French, a student whose only foreign language was German could not write a thesis on Nietzsche. The same applies to Freud. It would be difficult to reinterpret the Viennese master without considering the American Freudian revisionists, or the French structuralists. 3. We cannot write a thesis on an author or a topic by reading only the sources written in familiar languages. How can we know beforehand that the most influential secondary source on our author or topic is written in a language in which we are fluent? Surely questions like this can lead to paralysis, so here we should use common sense. Rules of academic rigor allow a Western student to acknowledge a secondary source written in Japanese, and to admit that he has not read it. This license to ignore usually extends to non-Western languages and Slavic languages, so that a student can complete a rigorous study on Marx and still admit his ignorance of Russian sources. But in these cases, the rigorous scholar will demonstrate that he has explored these sources through reviews or abstracts. For example, Soviet, Bulgarian, Czechoslovakian, and Israeli academic journals usually provide abstracts of their articles in English or French. Therefore, if the student works on a French author, he may manage with no knowledge of Russian, but he must read at least English. In any case, before the student chooses a topic, he must have the good sense to consult the existing bibliography in order to avoid considerable linguistic difficulties. In some cases, this is easy to determine. It is unthinkable to write a thesis in Greek philology without knowing German, the language in which there is a flood of important studies on the subject. Additionally, the thesis will inevitably introduce the student to a smattering of general terminology in all Western languages. For example, even if the student does not read Russian, he must at least be able to recognize the Cyrillic alphabet enough to determine whether a quoted book speaks of art or science. It takes an evening to gain this familiarity, and after comparing a few titles the student will know that Iskustvo means art and Nauka means science. Do not let this terrorize you. You should consider your thesis a unique chance to learn skills that will serve you for a lifetime. Let us form a final, conciliatory hypothesis. Suppose an Italian student is interested in the problem of visual perception pertaining to the topic of art. This student does not know any foreign languages, nor does he have the time to learn them. In addition to these limitations, let us suppose that the student must write a 6-month thesis for economic reasons. Although the student must graduate quickly and find employment, he is sincerely interested in his topic, and he eventually plans to study it more deeply when time permits. In this case, the student may narrow his topic to the problems of visual perception in relation to figurative arts, in particular contemporary authors. First, he must paint a picture of the psychological question, and on this topic there is a series of works translated into Italian, from Richard L. Gregory's Eye and Brain to major texts on the psychology of perception and transactional psychology. Then the student can bring the theme into focus in 3 authors. He can use Rudolf Arnheim for the Gestalt approach, Ernst Gombrich for the semiological informational approach, and Erwin Panofsky for his essays on perspective from an iconological point of view. After all, from 3 different points of view, these 3 authors discuss the role of nature and culture in the perception of images. There are some works, for example the books of Gillo Dorfels, that will help the student contextualize and link these authors. Once the student has traced these 3 perspectives, he can also attempt to apply their criteria to a specific painting. Perhaps by revising an already classic interpretation and integrating it with the more contemporary data that he has gathered from these authors. The final product will be nothing original, and it will fall between the survey and the monograph, but the student will be able to develop it on the basis of Italian translations. The student will avoid reproach for not having read all Panofsky, including work available only in German or English, because the thesis is not on Panofsky. Panofsky is relevant only to a specific aspect of the topic, and is useful as a reference only for some questions presented by the thesis. As I said in section 2. 1. This type of thesis is not the best choice, because it risks becoming incomplete and generic. To be clear, this is an example of a 6-month thesis for a student who wishes to gather preliminary data on a problem about which he truly cares. It is a makeshift solution, yet it can produce a decent thesis. In any case, if our Italian student does not know any foreign languages, and if he cannot seize this precious opportunity that the thesis provides to acquire them, the most reasonable solution is for the student to choose a specifically Italian topic, so that he can eliminate the need for foreign sources completely, or at least rely on the few sources that have been translated into Italian. Therefore, if the student wishes to write a thesis on the models of the historical novel in Giuseppe Garibaldi's prose, he should have some basic knowledge of Walter Scott and his role as the originator of the modern historical novel. In addition to the 19th century Italian polemic on the same subject, he could also find some reference works in Italian, and he could find at least the major works of Walter Scott in translation, especially if he searched the library for the 19th century Italian translations. A topic such as Francesco Domenico Guerrazzi's influence on the Italian culture of the Risorgimento would pose even fewer problems. Obviously, the student should never begin his work based on such optimistic assumptions and should always consult available bibliographies to determine which foreign authors have written on his topic. 2.6. Scientific or political? After the student protests in 1968, a widespread opinion emerged that students should write a thesis that is linked to political and social interests, rather than on cultural or bookish topics. If we believe this, then the title of this section becomes provocative and deceitful, because it suggests that a political thesis is not scientific. Nowadays, we often hear about science being scientific, scientific research, and the scientific value of a thesis, and these terms can cause unintentional misunderstandings, mystifications, as well as unfounded suspicions of cultural conservatism. 2.6.1 What does it mean to be scientific? Some identify science with natural sciences or quantitative research. In other words, they believe research is only scientific if it contains formulas and diagrams. From this perspective, research on Aristotle's ethics would not be scientific, nor would a thesis on class consciousness and the peasant revolts during the Protestant Reformation. Clearly, this is not the meaning that academia assigns to the term scientific. Let us try to understand by what reasoning we can call a work scientific. We can still take as a model the natural sciences as they have been defined since the beginning of the modern period. In this sense, research is scientific when it fulfills the following conditions. 1. The research deals with a specific object, defined so that others can identify it. The term object need not necessarily have a physical meaning. Even the square root of a number is an object, though it cannot actually be seen or touched. Social class is also an object of research, despite the objection that we can only know individuals or statistical means and not actual classes. In this sense, the class of all integers above 3,725 also lacks physical reality, though a mathematician could study it. Defining the object therefore means defining the conditions by which we can talk about it, based on rules that we establish, or that others have established before us. If we establish the conditions that allow anyone to discern an integer above 3,725 when he encounters it, we have established our object's rules of identification. Obviously, problems arise if we must speak, for example, of a fictional being such as the centaur, commonly understood to be non-existent. At this point, we have three alternatives. First, we can decide to talk about centaurs as they are presented in classical mythology. Here our object becomes publicly recognizable and identifiable, because we are dealing with the texts in which these mythical creatures appear. We will then have to determine it characteristics to an object being described in classical mythology must possess for it to be recognized as a centaur. Second, we can conduct a hypothetical investigation. 2. Determine which characteristics a creature living in a possible world should possess in order to be a centaur. Then we would have to define the conditions of existence of this possible world, taking care to inform our readers that all of our discussion is developed within this hypothesis. If we remain rigorously faithful to the initial assumption, we have defined an object appropriate for scientific investigation. Third, we can produce sufficient evidence to prove that centaurs are in fact real. In this case, to build a realistic object of discussion, we should present evidence so that others might agree that, regardless of the correctness of our hypothesis, there is something we can talk about. Obviously, this example is paradoxical, and I can't believe that anyone would want to write a thesis on centaurs, especially by way of the third alternative. Instead, my purpose is to show how it is always possible, given certain conditions, to constitute a publicly recognizable object of research. And if it is possible with centaurs, it will surely be possible with notions such as moral behavior, desires, values, or the concept of historical progress. 2. The research says things that have not yet been said about this object, or it revises the things that have already been said from a different perspective. A mathematically correct thesis that proved the Pythagorean theorem with traditional methods would not be a scientific work, because it would not add anything to our knowledge. At best, it would provide clear instruction on how to solve the theorem, much as a manual provides instruction on how to build a doghouse using wood, nails, a plane, a saw, and a hammer. As we have already said in Section 1. 1. A literature review can also be scientifically useful because the author has collected and organically linked together the opinions expressed by others on a particular topic. Similarly, an instruction manual on how to build a doghouse is not a scientific work, but a work that discusses and compares all known doghouse building methods can make a modest claim of scientific value. However, bear in mind that a literature review has scientific value only if something similar does not already exist in a given field. If someone has already written a work comparing the systems used to build a doghouse, writing a similar manual is at best a waste of time, at worst plagiarism. 3. The research is useful to others. An article that presents a new finding on the behavior of the elementary particles of physics is useful. An article that presents a transcription of an unpublished letter by the Italian Romantic poet Giacomo Leopardi, and that recounts the circumstances of its discovery, is useful. A work is scientific if, in addition to fulfilling the two conditions above, it advances the knowledge of the community, and if all future works on the topic will have to take it into consideration, at least in theory. Naturally, the scientific relevance is commensurate with the contribution significance. Scholars must take certain contributions into account in order to say anything relevant on a particular topic, while they can leave others behind without serious consequences. Recently, a number of letters from James Joyce to his wife have been published, specifically letters that deal with explicit sexual matters. People studying the origin of Molly Bloom's character in Joyce's Ulysses may find it useful to know that, in his private life, Joyce attributed to his wife a sexuality vivacious and developed Molly's. Therefore, the publication of these letters is a useful scientific contribution. On the other hand, some superb interpretations of Ulysses present a keen analysis of Molly's character without this data. Therefore, this contribution is not indispensable. We can find an example of a more important scientific contribution: 9th publication of Stephen Hero, the first version of Joyce's novel A Portrait of the Artist. As a young man, Stephen Hero is generally considered fundamental for understanding the development of the Irish writer, and is therefore a fundamental scientific contribution. Here we should address the so-called laundry lists often associated with extremely meticulous German philologists. These might include an author's shopping list, to-do list, and other incidental texts that are generally of low value. Occasionally these kinds of data are useful because they shed the light of humanity on a reclusive author, or they reveal that during a certain period he lived in extreme poverty. Other times these texts do not add anything to what we already know. They are small biographical curiosities with no scientific value, even if there are people who build reputations as indefatigable researchers by bringing these trifles to light. We should not discourage those who enjoy pursuing this type of research, but we also should understand that they are not advancing human knowledge. From a pedagogical perspective, if not from a scientific one, it would be more fruitful for them to write an entertaining popular biography that recounted the author's life and works. 4. The research provides the elements required to verify or disprove the hypotheses it presents, and therefore it provides the foundation for future research. This is a fundamental requirement. For example, to prove that centaurs live in Peloponnesus, I must do the following with precision: produce proof, recount exactly how I discovered and exhumed the archaeological find, instruct readers on how more evidence can be unearthed, and if possible, give examples of the precise type of bone that would disprove my hypothesis were it to be discovered in the future. If I accomplish these 4 goals, I have not only provided the evidence to support my hypothesis, but I have facilitated the continuation of research that may confirm or challenge it. The same is true for any topic. Suppose I am writing a thesis on an Italian extra-parliamentary movement that took place in 1969, and that is generally believed to have been politically homogeneous. In my thesis, I wish to prove that there were in fact two factions, one Leninist and the other Trotskyist. For my thesis to be successful, I must produce documents that verify my hypothesis, recount the circumstances of the acquisition of this material to provide a foundation for further research, and present the criteria by which I attribute the supporting documents to the members of the 1969 movement. For example, if the group was dissolved in 1970, I must weigh the relevance of material produced by members while the group was active against that produced by former member Softec group after its dissolution, considering that they may have cultivated their ideas while the group was still active. I must also define the criteria for group membership, such as actual registration, participation in meetings, and presumptions of the police. In doing this, I provide the foundation for further investigation, even if it may eventually invalidate my own conclusions. For example, let us suppose that I consider a person a member of the group based on evidence from the police, but future research exposes evidence that other members never considered the person in question as a member, and therefore he should not be judged as such. In this way, I have presented not only a hypothesis and supporting evidence, but also methods for its verification or falsification. The various examples that we have discussed demonstrate that a student can apply the requirements for scientific validity to any topic. They also illustrate the artificial opposition between a scientific and a political thesis. In fact, a political thesis can observe all the rules necessary for scientific validity. For example, I could write a thesis that is both scientific and political, and that would analyze my experience as an activist establishing an independent radio station in a working-class community. The thesis will be scientific to the extent to which it documents my experience in a public and verifiable manner, and allows future researchers to reproduce the experience either to obtain the same results or to discover that my results were accidental and not linked to my intervention, but to other factors I failed to consider. The beauty of a scientific approach is that it does not waste the time of future researchers. If a future researcher is working in the wake of my scientific hypothesis and discovers that it is incorrect, my initial hypothesis has still proven useful. In this example, if my thesis inspires a future researcher to also become an activist in a working-class community, my work has had a positive result, even if my original assumptions were naive. In these terms, there is clearly no opposition between a scientific and a political thesis, and as we have seen, one can write a scientific thesis without using logarithms and test tubes. On one hand, every scientific work has a positive political value in that it contributes to the development of knowledge, but on the other hand, every political enterprise with a chance of success must be grounded in the scientific diligence I have described. 2.6.2 Writing about direct social experience. Here our initial question returns in a new form: is it more useful to write an erudite thesis on an established, scholarly topic, or one tied to practical experiences in direct social activities? In other words, is it more useful to write a thesis that involves famous authors or ancient texts, or one that calls for a direct participation in the contemporary world, be it of a theoretical nature or of a practical nature? In itself, the question is pointless. A student will gravitate toward his interest and experience, and if he has spent 4 years studying Romance philology, we cannot expect him to write on Roman slum dwellers. Similarly, it would be absurd to require an act of academic humility from someone who has studied for 4 years with the Italian social activist and sociologist Danilo Dolci by asking the student to write a thesis on the royal family of France. But suppose the person who asks the question is a student in crisis, one who is wondering about the usefulness of his university studies, and especially about what to expect from the thesis experience. Suppose this student has strong political and social interests, and that he is afraid of betraying his calling by choosing a bookish topic. Now, if this student is already immersed in a political social experience that suggests the possibility of building a conclusive argument, he should consider how he could treat his experience in a scientific manner. But if he has not yet had such an experience, then it seems to me that his fear is naive, albeit noble. As we have already said, the experience of writing a thesis is always useful for our future work, not so much for the chosen topic, but instead for the training that it demands, for the experience of rigor it provides, and for the skills required to organize the material. Paradoxically, we could then say that a student with political aspirations will not betray his ideals if he writes a thesis on the recurrence of demonstrative pronouns in the writings of an 18th-century botanist, or on the theory of impetus in pre-Galilean science, or on non-Euclidean geometries, or on the dawn of ecclesiastical law, or on the mystical sect of the Hesychasts, or on medieval Arabic medicine, or on the article of criminal law on bid rigging in public auctions. A student can cultivate a political interest in unions, for example, by writing a historical thesis on workers' movements in the past century. A student can even understand the contemporary need for independent information among the subaltern classes by studying the style, circulation, and modes of production of popular xylographic prints in the Renaissance period. In fact, if I wanted to be controversial, I would advise a student whose only experience was in political and social activism to choose precisely one of these topics, rather than narrate his own experience. This is because the thesis will provide his last opportunity to acquire historical, theoretical, and technical knowledge, to learn systems of documentation, and to reflect in a more dispassionate manner on the theoretical and historical assumptions of his political work. Obviously, this is just my opinion. Since I wish to respect points of view different from my own, I will now address this question of someone who is immersed in political activity, someone who wishes to orient his thesis toward his work, and to orient his political experience to the writing of his thesis. It is certainly possible to do this, and to do it well. But to make such an endeavor respectable, it is necessary to clarify a few points. Occasionally a student will hastily prepare 100 pages of flyers, debate recordings, activity reports, and statistics and present his work as a political thesis. And sometimes the committee will even accept the work, out of laziness, demagogy, or incompetence. But this work is a joke, not only because it betrays the university's thesis criteria, but precisely because it does a disservice to the political cause. There is a serious way and an irresponsible way to participate in politics. A politician who approves a development plan without sufficient information on the community's situation is simply a fool, if not a criminal. Similarly, one can betray his political party by writing a political thesis that lacks scientific rigor. Once I encountered a student defending a thesis that dealt with a topic related to mass communication. He claimed that he had conducted a survey of the TV audience among workers in a certain region. In reality, he had tape-recorded a dozen interviews of commuters during 2 train trips. Naturally, the resulting transcriptions of these opinions could not constitute a survey, not only because they lacked standards of verifiability, but also because of the banality of the results. Consequently, a 30-page pseudo-survey that concludes with such predictable results is a joke. It also constitutes self-deception for the student, who believes he has acquired objective data, while he has only superficially supported his own preconceived opinions. A political thesis in particular risks superficiality for 2 reasons. First, unlike a historical or philological thesis that requires traditional methods of investigation, a thesis on a specific current social phenomenon often requires the student to invent his methodology. Secondly, a political thesis risks superficiality because a large segment of American-style social research methodology has fetishized quantitative statistical methods, producing enormous studies that are dense with data but not useful for understanding real phenomena. Consequently, many young politicized people are skeptical of this sociometry, and they accuse it of simply serving the system by providing ideological cover. But people who react this way often end up doing no research at all, and their thesis becomes a sequence of flyers, appeals, or purely theoretical statements. We can avoid this risk in various ways, including consulting serious works on similar topics, following the practices of an experienced group of activists, mastering proven methods of gathering and analyzing data, realizing that surveys are long and expensive and cannot be conducted in just a few weeks, etc. But since the problems presented by a historical thesis vary according to different fields, different topics, and students' skills, it is impossible to give generic advice. I will therefore limit myself to one example. I will choose a brand new subject on which no research has previously been done, that is of great topical interest, that has unquestionable political, ideological, and practical implications, and that many traditional professors would define as purely journalistic, the phenomenon of free radio stations. 2.6.3 Treating a journalistic topic with scientific accuracy. As most Italians know, scores of these stations have appeared in large Italian cities. There are a few even in centers of 100,000 inhabitants, and more continue to appear across Italy. They can be political or commercial in nature. They often have legal problems, but the legislation regarding these stations is ambiguous and evolving. In the period between the genesis of this book and its publication, the situation will already have changed, as it would change during the time it would take for a student to complete this hypothetical thesis. Therefore, I first must define the exact geographical and chronological limits of my investigation. It could be as limited as free radio stations from 1975 to 1976, but within those limits the investigation must be thorough and complete. If I choose to examine only those radio stations located in Milan, I must examine all the radio stations in Milan. Otherwise, I risk neglecting the most significant radio station in terms of its programs, ratings, location, and the cultural composition of its hosts. If I decide to work on a national sample of 30 radio stations, so be it. However, I must establish the selection criteria for this sample. If nationally there are in fact 3 commercial stations for every 5 political radio stations, or 1 extreme right-wing station for every 5 left-wing stations, my sample must reflect this reality. I cannot choose a sample of 30 stations in which 29 are left-wing or 29 are right-wing. If I do so, I will represent the phenomenon in proportion to my hopes and fears, instead of to the facts. I could also decide to renounce the investigation of radio stations as they appear in reality and propose an ideal radio station, much as I tried to prove the existence of centaurs in a possible world. But in this case, the project must not only be organic and realistic, but it must also consider the trends of the actual phenomenon. Therefore, a preliminary investigation is indispensable, even in this case. After I determine the limits of my investigation, I must define exactly what I mean by free radio station, so that the object of my investigation is publicly recognizable. When I use the term free radio station, do I mean only a left-wing radio station? Or a radio station built by a small group of people under semi-legal circumstances? Or a radio station that is independent of the state monopoly, even if it happens to be well organized and has solely commercial purposes? Or should I consider territorial boundaries and include only those stations located in the Republic of San Marino or Monte Carlo? However I choose to define the term, I must clarify my criteria and explain why I exclude certain phenomena from the field of inquiry. Obviously, the criteria must be defined unequivocally. If I define a free radio station as one that expresses an extreme left-wing political position, I must consider that the term is commonly used in a broader sense. In this case, I must either clarify to my readers that I challenge the common definition of the term and defend my exclusion of the stations it refers to, or I must choose a less generic term for the radio stations I wish to examine. At this point, I will have to describe the structure of a free radio station from an organizational, economic, and legal point of view. If full-time professionals staff some stations and part-time volunteers staff others, I will have to build an organizational typology. I must determine whether these types share common characteristics that can serve as an abstract model of a free radio station, or whether the term covers a series of heterogeneous experiences. Here you can see how the scientific rigor of this analysis is useful also from a practical perspective. If I wanted to open a free radio station myself, I would need to understand the optimal conditions for it to function well. To build a reliable typology, I could draw a table that compared the possible characteristics as they appear in the stations I have examined. I could present the characteristics of a given radio station vertically and the statistical frequency of the given characteristic horizontally. Below, I provide a simplified and purely hypothetical example with only 4 parameters: the presence of professional staff, the music-speech ratio, the presence of commercials, and the ideological characterization. Each is applied to 7 fictional radio stations. Table 2.1. Radio Beta, Radio Gamma, Radio Delta, Radio Aurora, Radio Centro, Radio Pop, Radio Canale 100. Professional staff.